Welcome to Black Music and the American University, Eileen Southern Story. My name is Carol Oja. I'm a music historian at Harvard and faculty director of the Humanities program at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. This is our second webinar about Professor Southern, who was a pathbreaking scholar of African-American music. In 1976, she became the first Black woman tenured in Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, with appointments in both music and what was then called Afro-American Studies. Southern retired in 1987, and since then, her legacy at Harvard has largely, sadly, been erased. Our Eileen Southern Initiative was conceived as an act of reparative justice through scholarship, marking a collaboration between Harvard's classrooms, its libraries, its choirs, and the Radcliffe Institute. Joining me in the core group have been Katie Callum, Andrew Clark, and Christina Linklater, together with many Harvard students. Today's webinar launches 3 days of events in honor of Southern. At the center is the residency of the Aeolians, an internationally acclaimed choir from Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama, an historically Black university affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I want to say welcome to the Aeolians and their conductor, Jason Max Ferdinand. They arrived in Cambridge today and are viewing this webcast from Sanders Theater. In addition to honoring Southern, the Aeolians' visit here pays tribute to Eva Beatrice Dykes, who founded the choir in 1946. In 1921, Dykes was the first Black woman to earn a PhD from Radcliffe College. So the history of the Aeolians and Oakwood University is intertwined with that of Harvard and Radcliffe. This afternoon, we will open with a film about Eileen Southern, then move to statements from distinguished scholars of African-American music. We will take a brief video tour of our digital exhibit about Southern's career, and we will conclude with discussion. First, a few words about Eileen Southern. In 2021, Southern's landmark book, The Music of Black Americans, celebrated its 50th anniversary. No such comprehensive text about African-American music had appeared before. Southern intervened in an academic field focused on white European music, while her generation of colleagues was overwhelmingly male. During her entire career, including at Harvard, she confronted gender and racial bias, and she had the courage to call out those challenges in interviews. With the Senate confirmation this afternoon of Ketanji Brown Jackson as the first Black woman to sit on the Supreme Court, it is an ideal moment to reflect on the confluence of gender, race, power, and what it takes to make change happen. With Black music today, its artistic depth and commercial impact are acknowledged globally, and a well-established interdisciplinary field exists for studying that music, one anchored in Southern's achievements a half-century ago. In an interview for our project, Portia Malsby, a specialist in Black music at Indiana University, observed that in Southern's day, music scholars, quote, needed to get away from just the masters. Malsby continued, I think she leaves with us an attitude that a topic doesn't have to be in vogue to merit study and research. Another lesson is you don't always have to be in step with the world, that the world will ultimately follow in your steps. Today, we will hear from several guests. Guthrie P. Ramsey Jr., a music historian, pianist, composer, professor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, and grandfather, a proud one. Marva Griffin Carter, a music historian at Georgia State University. Katie Callum, a postdoc in Harvard's GSAS, who will offer a video tour of our digital exhibit. Finally, Braxton D. Shelley, a scholar of music and divinity at Yale. Also, I want to give a special shout out to Edward Southern, son of Eileen and Joseph, and his daughter Nicole, who are joining us from Port Charlotte, Florida, where the Mid-County Regional Library is streaming our webinar, thanks to librarian Jennifer Zobelin. Our program begins with the film, Light the Way Home, Eileen Southern's Story, which introduces Southern and the challenges of her career. It was produced by talented Harvard undergraduates through a Radcliffe research partnership. Daniel Huang and Uzo Engwu are the filmmakers, and Devon Gates is the composer and performer. Johnny DeCam from the Media Production Center served as their generous filmmaking advisor and editor. Here then is Light the Way Home, Eileen Southern's story.
An example of a major university's response to student needs is Harvard's new Department of Afro-American Studies, headed by Professor Eileen Southern.
You know, Harvard is a place that you've heard about all your life. And I had visited the campus once, but it never occurred to me ever that I would be a professor here.
Dr. Southern believes that one of the paths to understanding Black history is through music.
Obviously, Black music does reflect the social conditions of the people who produced it. For example, in the 19th century, I doubt if the spirituals would have the poignancy that they have if they had not come from an enslaved people.
She was a person of steel. She had to be. She was the first Black woman tenured at the College of Arts and Science at Harvard University.
The book, The Music of Black Americans, came out in 1971. It was landmark, you know? It really filled a void in the history of American music. And she even said that herself in the preface to the first edition, this fills a void.
If you look beyond the words to think about what Eileen Southern did in that book, how she uncovered all of these narratives at a time when she did not have access to the technology that we have now. And those materials that she tapped into were things that we really had no basis of understanding, I think, in musicology.
It really enables us to tell a fuller story about American music history.
The Southerns, Eileen Southern and her husband Joe Southern, founded Black Perspective in Music, ensuring that the project of Black music scholarship would be carried forward, planting the seed in Sam Floyd of what became an institution. His book, The Power of Black Music, was based directly on the bibliography that Eileen Southern and Josephine Wright edited. Power of Black Music has become one of the foundational texts for the next generation.
In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that's the years she was doing her work. That's when Black people were being lynched. They did not expect women to make any achievements. And if you were a Black woman, of course you weren't going to do anything.
I refused to be treated differently than any other person. I just insisted upon being respected as an individual, as a member of Afro-American Studies, as a member of the Harvard community, and they refused to give me that kind of respect.
The Department of Afro-American Studies was born in quite revolutionary times. There was a great deal of unrest. Now, I was more concerned with her capacity to be a leader of Afro-American studies than her accomplishments as a musicologist.
Although she is the foremost authority on Black American music, she has found it difficult at times to be a double minority on the Harvard faculty. Working in the male-dominated university is difficult, she said, because men have a subtle way of putting you down, because they often do not accept women as scholars. Sexism and racism fused into one ism when Southern was chair of the Afro-American Studies at Harvard, a position she calls my most trying experience. The Harvard community treated her with hostility and sometimes contempt. She found little support within the department because often male faculty and students made merely existing a nightmare. Radcliffe Quarterly, September 1986.
For many years, there was absolutely no sign of her, no physical sign of her in the department that she had been a part of. That culture of erasure shaped much of what I understood about Eileen Southern. She was a part of a generation that created an infrastructure to incubate and institutionalize Black music in spaces that had never been conceptualized.
Eileen Southern is the legacy builder, the pioneer mover of a scholarship that no person of color can possibly undertake without recognizing three things: the cost, the courage, the consistency with which she applied herself. Their legacy looms large, and new generations recognize that this pioneer was someone who saw a world beyond what was presented to her.
All of this music comes out of miserable conditions, but the kind of, the music is produced by people who have a positive attitude toward life. Sure, life is very difficult, but they look forward to a time when it won't be difficult. In other words, I think that Black music has an optimism.
Dear Mrs. Southern, ever since I first became acquainted with your book, The Music of Black Americans, I have wanted to write and say how much debt music owes you in your work. When some of the dust has settled and the time comes for taking inventory, it will not be clenched fists and afros that will weigh much in the balance, but works of the mind such as yours which will light the way home.
Good, that was fine. Now, do you understand about the syncopation now? I have this little...
I will now pass the virtual floor to Professor Guthrie P. Ramsey, Jr.
Good evening, afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this great presentation. I'm going to turn my stopwatch on and make sure I don't go over. My queries and comments today are centered on some reactions to the notion that Eileen Southern's story, as you framed it here, can be fully fleshed out in its relationship to the American Academy. Of course it can, but are there other ways to understand the relevance and profundity of this story in other contexts? I admit that I've thought about Eileen Southern primarily as you have, as a scholar whose work that made my scholarly pursuits possible. I focused primarily on her accomplishments in research and writing throughout my career. The Music of Black Americans and the Journal of the Black Perspective in Music were my first stops, particularly when I was training in the early 1990s. As I experienced the documentary, this wonderful documentary, and the other inspiring projects that comprise this Eileen Southern Initiative, I've been encouraged to revisit Southern in other contexts as well, as well as my relationship to her scholarship. And here, the analogy that I would draw is that one of my pandemic habits that I formed was watching Nigerian film, and consequently, when anybody younger entered the room with an elder there, they would do a little bow, and I'm looking over some of my older writings, and that's essentially what I did. Is I just always made a bow to Eileen Southern, and then I went on about my scholarly business. But as this Eileen Southern initiative has taught me, there's much more to discover. Right now, I'd like to just share some briefly some directions that I'd like to pursue as I write about Eileen Southern in a forthcoming book titled Soundproof, which is sort of my version of the music of Black Americans. So one of the things that I'd like to think about is location. Eileen Southern was born, I believe, in Minneapolis and raised in Chicago. And although I don't recall her in her writing thinking about that much, she certainly was part of a cultural milieu that she shared with other artists. For instance, the photographer Gordon Parks was moved to Minneapolis, and in his memoir, A Choice of Weapons, he lays out that that Black community in marvelous detail. I'm also thinking about her being raised in Chicago during the time that Florence Price was also in Chicago. Florence Price, of course, being the composer and pianist who taught piano lessons and lived in the same artistic co-op that Eileen Southern taught piano lessons in. And I believe I read a line where she said that she taught so many piano lessons because she needed to amass as many quarters as possible. So thinking about that quarter piano lesson is something that I really love to explore. She describes her, the financial challenges of her family in much the same way that Florence Price and many other Black Chicagoans describe their existence in a very, very tough city to be in. And if you can also think about her being, pursuing her work as a classical pianist, and then on the one hand, and then on the other side, this rock hard financial hardship. And also you might think about her emerging and developing when gospel music itself was becoming a thing. So although she wrote her master's thesis on folk songs with Black composers, there was a lot of other music going on, and would be very useful to think about her work in relationship to that. I'm also thinking about comparing her work as a scholar and as a pianist to other Black women who were primarily artists and teachers. Like Eileen Southern, the sculptor Elizabeth Catlett was the first woman to get an advanced degree in art. She, when she matriculated to the University of Iowa in the 30s, that school was accepting Black students, but would not allow them to live in the dormitories. And later on, they offered her after her renown, they offered her an honorary doctorate and renamed one of the residence halls after her. Okay, so there's always this, it just takes longer for Black women artists to receive their due. Another person that I've been thinking about in the context of Eileen Southern's career is the painter Alma Thomas, who also taught junior high school throughout her painting career, in the same way that Eileen Southern funded her graduate education with elementary and high school teaching. And like Alma Thomas, the rewards came much later in life. Alma Thomas received her first solo exhibition at age 80 at the Whitney Museum 6 or 7 years before she passed. Again, one of the ways I'm thinking about understanding Eileen Southern's legacy is to think about it in a broader context than just music studies and comparing her to white male colleagues, but thinking about her as a Black woman cultural worker who was an artist, but also had to find ways to get in where she fit in. I could go on, but I'd like now to pass the mic over to Professor Marva Carter.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Dr. Eileen Southern is solely responsible for my career choice in musicology, for it was in the early 1970s as a graduate piano major at the New England Conservatory of Music that I first heard her lecture following the landmark publication of her musical history of Black Americans. Dr. Southern was the first Black musicologist I had ever seen. I was completely arrested by her presence, her accomplishments, the powerful content of her presentation, as well as the implications for me personally. She provided a blueprint for the direction that music could take in my life. Following her talk, I greeted her and she recruited me into the profession of musicology in that moment. With her all-knowing demeanor, engaging eyes, warm smile, and rapid rhythmic speech pattern, she began to interrogate me regarding my professional aspirations. And as one who had been on the concert pianistic track herself, she knew of its limitations for African-American women. As one who was literally creating a more inclusive musicological historiography, she was seeking recruits. Dr. Southern used her power of persuasion to entice me into the discipline on that fateful night. She concluded our conversation with the poignant question, if you and others don't go into this field, who's going to do this work when I'm gone? From that moment, I began an about-face to pursue musicology with a leaning toward ethnomusicology, first at Boston University and later at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. During my time at Boston University, Dr. Southern reminded me that she had already paved the way for other Black musicologists by concentrating her doctoral work on Renaissance studies before Black studies. Therefore, I would not need to prove myself by engaging in a European thesis topic. This was critical advice, which I may not have received otherwise. Consequently, I was able to write a biographical thesis on the composer-conductor Hall Johnson, who had been to New England Conservatory while I was there and conducted a choral concert featuring his Negro spiritual arrangements. Eileen Southern promptly assisted me in the writing of my thesis with answers to my inquiries by telephone or letter and providing contact information of those who knew and or worked with Hall Johnson. Among them were Bess Pruitt, the executor of his estate, and Marion Cumbo, with whom he performed chamber concerts of string quartets. Southern revealed background information of these culture bearers prior to my meeting them and offered her name as a point of introduction. In effect, she became an unofficial thesis advisor. Eileen Southern also encouraged me to submit an obituary essay on the African-American lyric tenor Roland Hayes, which was published in her Journal of the Black Perspective in Music. Moreover, I was able to connect with Dr. Southern at the annual American Musicological Meetings. I recall hearing her deliver an impressive paper on the 19th century African-American band director Frank Johnson at the 1976 meeting in Washington, D.C. This was my first annual meeting seeing someone who looked like me at the podium while addressing the attendees on a topic in which I could personally relate. She stood tall, even though rather short in stature, dressed in a two-piece suit, every hair pressed in place, bringing Frank Johnson out of the shadows before this august audience. My chest expanded with pride, for Eileen Southern was ushering an African-American hidden figure to light as never before. In addition to sharing pride, Dr. Southern and I also shared pain. When she arrived at Harvard permanently, she encouraged me to apply to the music program, so that I could formally work with her as a graduate student. Unfortunately, this was not to be, for my testing knowledge and skills did not meet the mark. Harvard's entrance examination required detailed analyses of European musical scores, identification of obscure listening excerpts, and essays covering the traditional Western art musical canon. Thankfully, these exams are no longer required to enter Harvard's graduate music program. For me, the rainbow in this rejected scenario occurred when Southern allowed me to audit her Harvard course on the history of Afro-American music. Consequently, I was able to see her up close and personal on a regular basis and to observe her classroom style. I remember Dr. Southern as being formal, engaging, with an infectious, sparkling smile, unpretentious, but firm with a no-nonsense posture. We used her history and its accompanying primary source readings as our textbooks. There were recorded musical examples on long-playing records, and once in a while, she illustrated on the baby grand piano and on the musically staffed blackboard. I will never forget her lecture on the singing of psalmody in New England during the 18th century. She led the class through illustrations, metrically counting the syllabled texts, and the class engaged in a call and response singing of the Psalms. She would then interchange various texts with corresponding tunes, illustrating different meters. She subsequently played recorded examples indicating how the Black church, in effect, Africanized this tradition. Today, I also use this approach to address this practice with my students. On some occasions after Southern's class, we would walk and talk together while leaving and commiserate over our similar administrative challenges. She as the director of the Afro-American Studies Department at Harvard, and I as coordinator of the African American Studies program at Simmons College. These were volatile times in American life when Blackness was fashionably expressed by James Brown with "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud," and by Nina Simone with "To be young, gifted, and Black is where it's at." To be Black women leading largely Black faculty on predominantly white campuses during the Black Power movement was particularly challenging. We would compare notes while fighting similar academic battles in uncharted territory on our respective campuses. I shall forever be grateful to this formidable, trailblazing scholar, Eileen Jackson Southern, who ignited a flame in me to join her intellectual pursuit to document the musical lives and legacies of Black Americans. She was convinced more than 50 years ago that Black musicians matter. It is now my pleasure to welcome back Carol Oja.
Thanks so much, Professor Carter. Next, we'll view a video tour of our digital exhibit.
Welcome to a brief tour of Eileen Southern and the Music of Black Americans. This digital exhibit highlights archival materials from the collection that Southern left to the Harvard University archives. Together with the accompanying text, photographs, letters, and other documents introduce visitors to Southern's life and legacy. One of our favorite images, courtesy of the Chinese University of Hong Kong Library, is of Southern and her husband Joseph on a cruise in 1979. They're pictured in Hong Kong with Harvard ethnomusicologist Rulan Pian. This is a note card Southern used for a talk on W.E.B. Du Bois in 1976. Regarding Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk, she wrote, "I find this book more moving each time I read it, and I have read it numerous times. I relate to each incident described, my heart aches for the persons discussed, and it warms to the writer's description of scenes of nature and of music." These materials and over 100 more are available to view in the image gallery. The Interviews Gallery serves as a repository for the Eileen Southern Initiative's Oral History Project. It features 20 conversations with Southern's former students, colleagues, and scholars impacted by her work. Visitors should also be sure to explore the interactive ArcGIS map that traces Southern's global correspondence. Her reach as a scholar was international, and at a time when music studies focused heavily on the West, her relationships with scholars in Africa are especially noteworthy. Visitors interested in learning more about Southern's remarkable scholarship will find an extensive list of her publications on the bibliography page. The Eileen Southern Initiative team hopes that this exhibit will inspire conversations, research projects, musical collaborations, and other ventures aimed at honoring Southern achievements and continuing her work which demonstrates that Black music has been and continues to be a vital force in American life.
Professor Braxton Shelley will now turn our attention to the Aeolians and their founder, Eva Beatrice Dykes.
Thank you, Carol. I want to talk briefly about the burden of being first. There is a burden attached to being first. As the first Black woman tenured in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, a pioneer in the academic study of Black music, and the first to do so many other things, Professor Eileen Southern must have been well acquainted with this weight. What she accomplished in the face of such great difficulty merits much more recognition than this program or the initiative of which it is a part can provide. While the burden of firstness was surely Professor Southern's to bear, it was not hers alone. Indeed, we can gain a greater appreciation of Eileen Southern's contributions to both academy and society by putting her life and work in conversation with that of another first, Dr. Eva B. Dykes. Eva Beatrice Dykes, a musician, administrator, and scholar of English literature, was the first Black woman to complete the requirements for the PhD at any university in the United States. When she came to Radcliffe in 1915, the college refused to accept her undergraduate degree from Howard, requiring her to start over in a sense. But 2 years later, in 1917, Radcliffe granted her an A.B. in English, magna cum laude, electing her to membership in Phi Beta Kappa. 1921, the year of Dykes' terminal degree, was a heady one. Two other Black women, Sadie Alexander and Georgina Simpson, took the PhD that spring from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Chicago, respectively. While the specifics of Radcliffe's academic calendar meant that Dykes' commencement followed Simpson and Alexander by a few weeks, Eva Beatrice Dykes is distinguished as the first Black woman to complete the academic labors for the PhD. Armed with a PhD in English philology, having written a dissertation on Alexander Pope's views on slavery and influence on American writers, Dykes taught English at Walden University in Nashville, Tennessee, and at Washington, D.C.'s Paul Laurence Dunbar High School, this before joining the prestigious faculty of Howard University. In 1944, after teaching at Howard for 14 years, Dykes made a rather shocking career move. Dykes decided to leave Howard's preeminent faculty, which included figures like Hazel Harrison, Rayford Logan, Sterling Brown, and E. Franklin Frazier. Dykes headed south, relocating to Huntsville, Alabama to join the faculty of a small, unaccredited Adventist junior college named Oakwood. As the first terminally degreed person appointed to the faculty at Oakwood, Dykes assumed positions of significant leadership, serving as the chair of the English department and the division of the humanities. In these roles and in many others, Dykes played a key role in the accreditation of what would become Oakwood University. While the significance of Professor Dykes' contributions to Oakwood is evident in the library which bears her name, Dykes' legacy has also traveled the globe, living on through the ensemble she formed in 1946. One of the first things Professor Dykes did after arriving at Oakwood was to start a choir. She named them the Aeolians. For Dykes, who was equal part teacher, administrator, and musician, forming this ensemble seemed to be an integral part of Oakwood's advancement. Building the institution seemed to almost necessitate building a choir. Stepping to the legacy of ensembles like the Fish Jubilee Singers, the Aeolians of Oakwood University have played invaluable roles as ambassadors for their institution over the last 75 years. While no ensemble so clearly extends the influence of Professor Eileen Southern, the impact of her scholarship for scholars of music, African American studies, and in fields like religion is similarly global. There are very many parallels between Professor Dykes and Professor Southern. Both were builders, both chaired departments, both taught at institutions that differed widely in terms of resources and prestige. Howard and Walden and Oakwood for Dykes, Prairie View, Southern, Brooklyn College and Harvard for Southern. Both seem to believe that their training, whether in English philology or in the historical study of Renaissance music, was consonant with significant practical and scholarly investments in Black American music. And both of these Black women who played important roles in the history of their respective faculties were also accomplished musicians. While Southern's relationship to music might be more expected given her disciplinary home, the historical record shows that Dykes was busy crafting compositions as early as the age of 12. And what fruit has grown from Dykes' musicianship? A few years ago, I had the opportunity to introduce the Aeolians before they sang at an event in the Memorial Church. This event took place just a few weeks after an extraordinarily acclaimed performance by the Aeolians at the national meeting of the American Choral Directors Association. Although I live streamed much of the event in question, taking in the beauty and breadth of the choir's presentation, I was most struck by a recurring phrase used to describe the impact of their performance. All over my various social media platforms, I kept seeing comments about how the Aeolians, quote, broke ACDA. The Aeolians broke ACDA. When I introduced them, I used this phrase to name the transcendent effects that the Aeolian singing routinely produces, the kind of emphatic breaking out and end that you will see if you attend tomorrow night's concert. But only later did I learn that the Aeolians of Oakwood University were the first choir from a historically Black college or university to be so prominently positioned during a national ACDA meeting. While it was hard for me to believe that a 2019 event could be the first of any kind, or that ACDA stages had not been graced by exponents of the excellence that is the HBCU choral tradition, it also made sense to me as yet another experience of the burden of being first. If, as so many claimed, the Aeolians broke the ACDA, their breaking was only possible because of a whole lot of building, ways made, paths paved, space carved out for the practice and study of Black music. This is the contribution of Eileen Southern and Eva B. Dykes. And this is important to note because it is easy to overlook the significance of building when deconstruction and abolition are the more contemporary terms of art. Building, even at the risk of being forgotten, this is the burden of being first. Whether through founding ensembles like the Aeolians of Oakwood, or by laying what Tammy Kernodle calls an intellectual infrastructure for the study of Black music, both Eileen Southern and Eva B. Dykes use the scholarly, cultural, and institutional tools available to their generations to form a foundation on which so many now stand. It is fitting then that this year-long celebration of Professor Southern will have as one of his highlights a joint performance by choirs from Harvard College and the Aeolians of Oakwood University, in a genre-spanning concert, including songs commissioned in honor of Professor Southern and her work. These ensembles will lift every voice, resounding the rich traditions that benefited so mightily from the pioneering work of Eva B. Dykes and Professor Eileen Southern. So it is now my pleasure to welcome back Professor Ramsey and Professor Carter for discussion and to take a few questions from the audience. I want to start with a question about the future of music studies. I'm struck by the honor of being on this sort of panel with the two of you. I've been citing Professor Ramsey since I was a junior, well, sophomore in college. I remember so vividly sharing a cab with you, Professor Carter, at AMS in Vancouver. And I obviously, am because you are. I'm curious, as you sort of span both your history in the field and think about the current state of the field, what you see on the horizon for music studies, and what you think the enduring significance of Professor Southern's work will be for generations to come. I'll direct it to Professor Carter first.
Well, I certainly see a lot of digitized materials, including her book, and more recorded performances, more performances that are done of African-American composers by symphonies and other ensembles that would be recorded as well. More coursework in the area of contemporary music, hip hop artists, along with other popular genres. I see gospel music and all musics that have been of African descent included in the curriculum, and fully included, not merely sort of isolated or marginalized, one course here or one program there during Black History Month, but actually as a part of the examinations that are required and other aspects of the discipline.
What about you, Professor Ramsey?
I think that Eileen Southern laid the groundwork for the future studies. And like, I'm thinking of 3 realms right now. First of all, the work she did in gospel music, as you know, Professor, just set the stage for what I'm calling the new gospel music studies that you are a avant-garde figure in. I'm thinking about your book, Healing for the Soul. I'm thinking about Flaming, Alicia Alola Jones's book, and then Mark Burford's masterful biography of Mahalia Jackson. All of those are 3 premier examples of what can happen when the foundation is laid, and then what you guys are thinking about in terms of gender and sexuality in gospel music, in terms of the analysis of a single figure, and what kind of cultural formations that can teach us about in your work. And then, of course, the music and life of ... that Mark Burford has massively shown us. I'm also thinking about how in 1997, in the 3rd edition, Eileen Southern talked about rapper's delight, okay? So I'm thinking that here's a woman who wrote a dissertation on Renaissance music and was also listening to hip hop, you know, she was keeping very, very current in her work. And thirdly, I'm thinking about how she intended for the Black perspective in music to be actually about the diaspora and not just about, you know, the United States music, how she forecasted that this was the way things were supposed to go in her work. So I'm thinking about those 3 areas that have actually manifested for us, and she laid the groundwork.
Great. I wonder, sort of continuing on this same theme, if you would talk about the methodological practice, is sort of the way Professor Southern's book, Music of Black Americans, and then the readings published later made available or put into dialogue sources that were not available, and how the availability of those materials are useful for you in your own scholarship or in the classroom.
Well, I have actually used the biographical work that dictionary of Afro-American and African musicians, particularly in my courses where I've asked students to write papers dealing with Black Georgian musicians, either born in Georgia, worked in Georgia, lived or died in some connection with Georgia. And she has wonderfully chronicled these musicians in the rear of the book according to the states that they were affiliated with. So it's made things easy to just go there and assign students or have them choose a given personality from that list. I've already alluded to her method of psalmody in my classes. I have found also quite useful. But frankly, her works are the go-to place for any area of study or inquiry involved with African American music and musicians. I also find her work called Images, which does not get a lot of attention, that is iconographic with wonderful pictorial illustrations of African American music and musicians through time. It is a great source that could be used for PowerPoints or films and other ways that you would need to illustrate African American music and musicians in some way. I think is likewise another place to go for resourceful information.
As Professor Carter mentioned, of course, she's the first stop. If you have to get a lecture together, you start with Southern. I'm thinking that she also, for me, demonstrated how we as scholars, particularly Black scholars working on Black music, can think about our audiences as being capacious and large and not just directed to the academy. When she did her work with the journal, she had the first issue featured an oral history with U.B. Blake. And it's very engaging and obviously meant not only for her scholarly work, but for the public. She published in Black World in the 70s, which was, of course, a very public, a journal. She was not just directing her efforts at the academy. And thirdly, when she published in the Music Educators Journal in the 70s, she included the work of Black composers working in the 1970s. So this comes out in the 70s, and she's sharing musical excerpts and examples of these composers' work. And it had to be their new work, because I looked at the copyrights for these works, and she's talking to composers and saying, you know what, I'm going to write about your music. I'm gonna write about my contemporaries' music in such a way that classroom teachers will have no excuse not to include this music in their curricula. And so what's the lesson? The lesson is to pay attention to your contemporaries and to use your platform as scholars to reach the public for the greater good.
Mm-hmm. You raise a really interesting point there. Because in 1972, when she publishes an article about sort of new origin for the spiritual in the Black Scholar, it's hard to imagine other musicologists, right, who were publishing in venues outside, right, the narrow confines of a music journal. So the Black World is one of them, and even an interdisciplinary journal like the Black Scholar in the early 70s, Professor Southern's intellectual footprint, right, is stretching out in a way, this is before the new musicology, right? So it's hard to imagine that the conversation is music out at that moment, instead of, sort of pulling in these other disciplinary formations. I wonder, I have a question about the lessons from Professor Southern's career for scholars who want to change the academy. Would either of you like to muse a bit on any lessons you see evident in her life and how they might be applicable to folks working now to make change?
Can I take that one, Professor? Sure. I want to say one thing I learned from her that was so important, is I wonder how it felt when she had done all this work, dipping and dodging segregation for 20 years before she even got her degree, and then to get to Harvard and believing that she's in the avant-garde and working that she's in the avant-garde of Black struggle. And then to deal with this generational shift in what students thought was progressive and what was regressive. And it reminded me of, when I ended my career during, in my teaching career anyway, during Black Lives Matter. After having gone through all of these first, like Eileen Southern, and then dealing with a shift in what the younger generation believes is what is relevant, what is politically astute. And so one of the things I would like to share is that you have to be kind of be able to take that generational shift and flex with it and not take it personally, because generation after generation will deal with the kind of new politics of struggle each time. So that's one of the things I think that is a strong takeaway from Eileen Southern's career.
Well, many lessons I could learn from her. Certainly her work ethic is unmatched. Perseverance. She also was a quiet mover. When African-American music was not accepted initially at the institution in New York where she was teaching, or shall I say put down, it was believed that there was nothing to be learned beyond jazz, perhaps, in a course. She simply walked out of the room and showed the world what there is to learn from African-American music and musicians by writing the books that she wrote. So my lesson learned is just do the work. You don't have to talk about it. You don't have to debate it. Just go and do the work. It will speak for itself.
Yeah, that's one of the points I was trying to make in the presentation, is to, to think about what it means and looks like to be radical in different moments. I think, Guy, that's what you're after in part, and it's so. It almost is like a, whatever planned obsolescence is in the tech world, in some ways, if you do your job right, the whole point is to look like a relic, which, as you say, you just sort of have to be ready to go with, and to take it and to not take it personally. But I'm struck again by what it must have been like to be for Dr. Dykes, to be a Black woman running a department in Alabama in 1940s, or to be chairing a department at Harvard in the 70s, Black woman, and the indignities.
Unfortunately, you can just ask any Black woman in the academy now who is chairing a department.
Yes.
And so when that is joined to the sort of intramural critique about the sort of politics of the moment, then that is a sort of doubly complex situation to work through. I wonder if, though, Professor Carter, you might share any of the recollections you had. You were, running a program at Simmons at the same time as she was running the program.
Yes.
And so I know you have so many moments.
Yes.
We're sharing notes, but I think it'd be really enlightening for all of us to get more access to what it was like.
Well, I was about 25, first of all. And so the faculty that I was chairing, many of those members were older than I was. And I was not completely finished with my graduate work. Yet, let me also contextualize my position in that I had, prior to coming to Simmons College, worked at Boston University, which was the very first African-American studies program of a graduate level in the country. And it was started not with protest, but it was systematically founded by Adelaide Cromwell, a Harvard PhD sociologist. So I did have that template as a model in this position. And I'm sure also that's why I got the position, because of that experience. But beyond that, it was difficult in that you were working in a white administration that has basically chosen you to be in this position, yet you're also working for largely an African-American faculty. And there were some Black students as well at Simmons College. So you cannot be Black enough for the Blacks, and you can possibly be too Black for the whites. You know, it's a tight rope. And if you're not very careful, you can lose your mind in that situation. Because it is, it's a crazy position to be in every way you want to look at it, particularly during the Black Power period, where people were raising their fists and hollering Black Power. So I don't know what more I can say, but
and I'm sure the brothers didn't make it all that easy either. No. You know, just to put that on the table for future discussion.
Yeah, right. Yes, they particularly gave you a difficult time. The brothers did. Yeah. They really saw you as soft-spoken and definitely not militant enough for them. Yet here you are actually representing Black Power. You know, you don't have to raise your fist to do that, though.
So this is a really fascinating place to end, returning basically to the double bind, right? A sort of gender and racial discrimination that Professor Southern lived with and dealt with and still endured. Nevertheless, she persisted.
Yes.
And so we're going to wrap up our conversation now. My pleasure to introduce or to bring back Carol Oja, who will close out this wonderful time discussion.
Well, thanks to the three of you. This has just been wonderful. So this does conclude today's program. I want to thank Braxton Shelley for his thoughtful presentation and for moderating the conversation. Guthrie P. Ramsey Jr. and Marva Carter for their reflections on Eileen Southern and her legacy. Uzo Ngwu, Daniel Huang, Devin Gates, and Johnny DeCam for the meaningful video. Katie Callum and Christina Linklater for their dedication to the Eileen Southern Initiative, and our audience for the stimulating questions. I hope you will join us tomorrow evening for a celebratory concert in Sanders Theater with the Aeolians of Oakwood University and the Harvard choruses. It will include new works by composers Rosephanie Powell and Marcus L.A. Garrett, which were commissioned in honor of Southern by Harvard's Department of Music. Yet another new composition, this one by Devin Gates, a Harvard College junior, will also be premiered. The pre-concert panel begins at 7 p.m. and the concert is at 8. Tickets are free and available through the Harvard box office and at the door. We will also be streaming the concert live on YouTube. Further information is posted here in the chat. I hope you will join us. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website, radcliffe.harvard.edu. Please visit that site for information about future Radcliffe programs and to see videos of past events, including last November's webinar about Eileen Southern. Thank you again for joining us today, and take care.